You know, the more I see from artificial intelligence, the more and more I'm convinced of why Jesus had to come when he did. Literally every single day, I see something online that I question if it's real or not.
So that little black or white fallacy is just clip one of 4 or 5 clips that I'm going to show you that come from the same 1-minute short Melissa packed a ton in that we're going to be replying to for today's Tuesday Takedown. And I know we just replied to Melissa about a month ago in this video, but again, her reach is so huge. And she's saying so many things here that I'm seeing Christians really respond to that seem to me to just not be thought out. And that's where I want to come in. So her first point is that, in today's day and age, with all this AI generated content, all this fake news, all this scandal, it's a good thing God didn't choose to place his son on earth now, because who could believe him? How could we know? As if God would be limited by such things. But let's assume God has to work within these confines is our only other option, and this is why I called it a black or white fallacy. 2,000 years ago, when there's no technology in a very small, remote part of the Middle East? I think not. And so the way I'm going to answer this first question is to give you 8 alternatives. We're going to breeze through these, but I just want to show so many other times. First of all, how about still during the Roman era, but just a century or two later, as the Pax Romana continued and we get this Roman peace, we get the development of more roads, a lot of what actually helped Christianity spread when it did. It would have been much easier for Jesus to do some of that missionary work himself. Or how about the Islamic Golden Age? This is the 8th through the 14th centuries. Trade networks are much more diverse. There's a ton of cultural exchange. We have a lot of advancements in literature, philosophy, and science. You take someone like Jesus and put him in that time and place, and things can really spread. Not to mention, and it's interesting, we could talk about some of the ways this could change, but maybe Islam never even gets a start, a footing. Christianity's biggest competitor wiped out. Why not just during the Renaissance, the 14th through the 17th centuries? Here we have a renewed interest in art, in science, in exploration. Most importantly, we have the invention of the printing press in the 15th century, revolutionizing the spread of ideas. That seems like an excellent time to have Jesus come. And by the way, I can already hear some of you thinking, what about all the people in the last 15 centuries that wouldn't have had Jesus? You're going to have to answer that for all the thousands of years between what happened in the Old Testament and when Jesus came. Which also begs the question, what if Jesus had come before? Maybe a good time would have been, I don't know, when everything was going wrong before God flooded the whole earth in Genesis 6. Maybe Jesus should have been in the garden with Adam and Eve. Maybe instead of confusing everyone at Babel, Jesus comes down and helps them understand God's mission for them. And we stay united with one language where everyone is in the same spot before God purposely confuses and spreads everyone out. The idea that Jesus came at just the right time in history is hilarious for so many reasons. Hopefully you're starting to see that, but I'm not done. I want to talk about some other times in the past before this age of confusion where Jesus could have come. Kind of overlapping with the Renaissance, what about the age of exploration? This is centuries 15 through 17. We're discovering new lands. We're establishing new colonies. We can start reaching more people quicker with the truth of this gospel message of Jesus. Now the whole of the continent of Africa can hear. Now Asia can be reached way sooner and way more completely, and the Americas are going to get equal representation finally. This would have been a great time. Or the Enlightenment between the 17th and 19th century. All these intellectual and philosophical achievements and advancements. The rise of rationalism and skepticism and scientific process. Talk about a fertile ground for discussing pure truth. Or let's move forward again, the Industrial Revolution between the 18th and 19th centuries. Trains, steamships. Oh my gosh, talk about getting your message out there immediately. Imagine Paul's missionary journeys if he had had access to this level of technology. 2 left here, and then we'll move on to the next clip. What about the early 20th century? We have mass communication with radio and television. Imagine Jesus preaching into a microphone his message for literally the whole world to hear. Right at the height of our development of weapons and world wars, what if Jesus then came to bring peace to the earth, like the Messiah was supposed to do? Finally, on a global level where literally everyone can be reached in the same minute. And where's the excuses? There's no fake AI back then. And this is the same thing, she's acting like this has been around forever, but even the late 20th century, the 90s, the early 2000s, we have the internet, but we still don't have it clouded with all of this fake content. Imagine Jesus's resurrection being broadcast. Imagine a Reddit Q&A with Jesus. this. And I know this all sounds so silly, and you can make excuses for each one of these. Oh, well, if it was that clear, no one would need faith. But no one gets mad about the supposed 500 witnesses and how it robbed them of their chance for faith. More witnesses is better, right? How about 500 million witnesses? Who can argue with that? Who all get the chance because they live in a day of opportunity to record their own journals. It's not just one person making a claim one time about them. We could hear from everyone who was witness to it. In fact, if I look back in history, it's almost like 2,000 years ago in that small part of the world would have been one of the worst times for the savior of the world to come. Now, if you just want to talk about the savior of the Jews, sure, we could argue that too. But the Christian perception and belief is that Jesus came to save the whole world by the act that he accomplished during 3 years of ministry at this time in the small area of the Middle East. So quickly, let me cover why that was such a bad time. Primitive technology, for one, going against what she's saying, a lack of travel opportunity, a lack of being able to spread a consistent word. All of these textual variants that we're dealing with, they go away with the printing press. How about geographic isolation in general? This is not a good plan for worldwide salvation. You have a limited audience with bad literacy rates who has to rely on oral tradition, which is a horrendous way of disseminating information accurately and truthfully, high mortality rates, and low life expectancy. This is also problematic to give people enough time to encounter ideas and have some consistency. Those high mortality rates due to all the disease and famine and drought and all the inconsistencies that to some degree many of us in many parts of the world today can control, you have people focused on survival more than preserving the perfect word or understanding the theological details. You had a cultural resistance from the Jews, you had an uneducated public, you had a lot of trouble with the diversity of language. Like, this is a bit of a nightmare, actually, when you think about it. And then the slowness of the ability to reach the missionary journeys that would need to be. I mean, you have things like Paul's shipwreck getting in the way of certain communities hearing. Do you know how uncommon shipwrecks are today? Not to mention all the copying, the slowness of the manual labor required to get this message duplicated. I mean, what a horrible time to come. But I've gone on this first clip long enough, and I promise I will not take this much time going forward. Let's watch clip 2.
2,000 years ago, a group of people saying that they saw someone rise from the dead and perform miracles means it wasn't blindly believed or watched through a dumb phone. It was witnessed.
I'm going to spend like less than a minute on this one. It's just so egregiously incorrect that because 2,000 years ago, we didn't have a dumb phone, as if our phones aren't like the definition of a miracle, that we had to rely on real witnesses because no one ever told lies, no one ever exaggerated, no one ever made up stories. Like, is she applying this to every other culture that has ever said things were witnessed that she doesn't believe in? And even if it was witnessed by a few people, again, go back to everything I just covered. We of course have good reason not to trust them, just like Melissa would say she has good reason not to trust the Hindu mythologies or the Norse mythologies or the Mayan mythologies or the Native American mythologies, etc. You think people didn't claim there were witnesses to these things? This is just so silly, and we're actually going to cover it in another clip. Let's keep moving.
Not only was there a high moral honor code at that time.
Oops, we got to stop it right there. A high moral honor code at that time. Now, there's a couple ways that people talk about history. They look at today's moral advancements and they say, look how backwards these people were in the past. Or sometimes they look at things they don't like today and they say, look at how nice and correct things were in the past. And I think it's obviously somewhere in between. Yes, there has been moral advancements. And yes, it is unfair to take today's moral advancements and say, oh, I would have been better 2,000 years ago. It is okay to say we should have been better 2,000 years ago. But yeah, I'm sure I'm a product of my time and place. And so I'm enjoying some moral truths like slavery being bad that we all pretty much recognize today that people 2,000 years ago didn't recognize. So it's not unfair of me to call out that that's not a morally superior position to hold. And I'm trying to figure out where she's even getting this from, this idea of a higher moral honor code. Is it because the world was smaller and reputation mattered more? Because I can understand that in a small community, and people who grow up in small towns today will know this too. You can't get away from your past as easily as if you live in New York City. But that doesn't mean people were inherently more moral. It means that the things that worked in small communities like gossip were an effective shaming system to keep people in line more. People were not just naturally better people back then, and crime still happened. If you gave give Melissa a look into living at that time and living in this time in terms of the morality of the day, she would be a fool not to choose to be in her current position. You think she would have had a speaking platform 2,000 years ago? You think she would have had any of the rights that she enjoys today? Do you think her vote would have mattered if voting was even allowed for what rules and constructions were ruling her life? When Paul tells her to shut up in church, do you think that she's just going to quietly submit? It's hilarious to me that she's talking about a time where a man that was supposedly innocent, again, I'm going with her logic here, was crucified. And in doing so, they actually let a known criminal go. Is this the high honor system that she's talking about? We utilize the death penalty far less than the Romans did at that time. And when we do, we try to make it as humane as possible. That's just one example of why what she's saying makes no sense. Again, by reading her own Bible stories and believing them to be literal descriptions of truth, we couldn't possibly believe there was a higher moral code being followed at that time. Here's some other quick examples. How about social inequality, again, for women or people that believe differently or foreigners? Or how about that slavery was still practiced? Well, Brandon, slavery is still practiced today. Don't you know about the U.S. prison system? I am not saying we live in a perfectly moral system today, but I'm saying it is disingenuous to act like there hasn't been progression, or that even if you could argue we've gone backwards in some things, that things were so morally correct back then that no one would dream of telling a lie, of building a lore, of creating a myth, of exaggerating a story, of saying something did happen when it didn't because of a bias or a personal outcome? Is that what she's trying to get us to believe? Or does she mean just within Jews? Maybe that's what she meant, because the Romans were so evil and everyone around was so evil and all the pagan practices were so evil. But the Jews had a high moral code? I bet that's what she means, because they were following the Torah. I would encourage her to look at those 613 commandments, if that's the higher honor code that she is indeed referencing, and tell me how that, A, is actually better than what we have today, and B, if there's any proof that people followed those rules more than people follow rules today. It kind of feels to me, like I said, that in-between spot is you've always had rules and guidelines and philosophy and ethics, and then you always have bad actors. And you can quibble about some of this, but what you cannot tell me, or what you cannot possibly get me to believe, is that people somehow, for no reason that she's explaining, were so moral and honorable that they would have not made up this story. And that's what we have today, is a bunch of liars. And so Jesus had to come when people were willing to tell the truth. If we stick with that, I want to know how any other religion ever got off the ground. What a naive idea that people weren't willing to lie. What a naive idea that people weren't willing to build myth, that people weren't willing to fill in gaps. I could go on forever about how erroneous this point is, but let's move on to the next one.
It's almost unthinkable to find any reason why the New Testament authors would have written under those circumstances. They gained nothing but death, sickness, and persecution.
This has been handled so many times. I don't want to get hung up or spend much time here, but no, not all of them died or were persecuted or got sick because they were willing to preach this message or write these things down. She's obviously still believing in traditional authorship, where we know that the New Testament Gospels weren't even written by sources that we know who they are. So how can we know what their outcome was? And yeah, you can read the book of Acts, which we just covered, and has good reason to believe that it is propaganda and fiction, and say, look at these horrible things that happened to some of these people. And I'm not saying no Christians have ever been martyred, or that people didn't put some sacrifice on the line to preach something they believed in. But once again, and of course, that does not make the thing true. No more true than any Muslim who's ever died for Allah. If she's not going to accept that people are willing to be martyrs, that people are willing to die for things they believe in, even though those things aren't true, then she is completely being oblivious to the reality that we live in today and of everything that has happened to anyone who has believed in any other God before, during, or after Jesus Christ. I cannot believe people are still making these arguments. And I think there's one last clip for us.
There was no technology to fake a healing, a miracle, or a resurrection.
First, I just encourage Melissa to go to any magic show, any street magician, any illusionist that doesn't use technology, and many don't, and see that you can make someone believe something that's not true. Even today, in today's day and age, of all of this skepticism, of all of this knowing better, we've seen behind the scenes, we've had magicians explain to us what they're doing, we've had mentalists tell us what psychological properties they're taking advantage of when they do this kind of a thing. That wasn't happening back then. You had a very illiterate, naive, and gullible public, at least more so than you have today. And again, like the last point, Jesus is not the only person that has ever been recorded to be resurrected. So if you simply don't have the technology to fake a resurrection, how do you not believe in every single account of resurrection, including the Messiah figures that came before, during, and after Jesus that made similar claims, yet alone all the other religions that make these kinds of claims? Does she believe that ancient Judaism and early Christianity were the only places where recorded healings and miracles and resurrections happened? Does she really believe that? Because again, she just needs to be consistent. If we didn't have the technology to fake these things, she needs to believe every single one happened. And then how do you sort out the truth? This is the definition of stopping short. Oh, here's an issue. I'm going to just stop right here though with it, because if I apply it to everything else, it actually invalidates my original point. And again, it feels like low-hanging fruit, but the amount of people that watch her or watch anyone like her or participate in her comments, like, this is such a good point. Oh my gosh, this is irrefutable proof. This is undefeatable. Like, just take a second. And this is what is so vastly needed, I think, in everything. To learn how to think critically, to get some perspective in your life, whether it is world history or religious history or cultural differences, because as soon as you have a base in any of that, I'm not an expert in any of those things, but I know enough to know why they all disprove everything that she has said. Essentially, her argument comes down to it's old, so it's true. And this is something that we still do today. Like, we have cults today way bigger than the early Christian Jewish sect that are still talking about resurrections, miracles, healings, all of these things. And she doesn't believe them. Why? Because they're recent, because they're modern, because they must be doing something. They must be taking advantage of some new system, because it's not old, it's not ancient, it's not this myth, right? There is something in our brain that just screams, oh, it's old, people have believed it for a long time, it must be true. And yeah, that's totally different than when my neighbor claims they had a vision. I don't believe them, but I believe Paul. Why? And I did mean to give some actual answers to the last point here, besides look at modern day magicians. First would be, again, understand the cultural norms of any time and place. There were always magicians, shamans, witch doctors, charlatans, con artists, whatever you want to call it. And she might attribute some of those to demonic practices. How about just your straight up human who takes advantage of other people by tricking them? That has and always will exist. And if you don't think they had creative ways of doing it before technology, you're ignorant. Also, a lack of scientific understanding back then, right? It's very hard to remember the lack of understanding that the common man had at that time. They didn't have a medical understanding of the difference sometimes between someone being possessed or a mental deficiency or dead or in a coma or sleeping. I mean, Christians can't even agree if what Paul did in Acts was a resurrection or if the man had fallen and got hurt and knocked out or was in a coma or was asleep. Psychosomatic effect, go look it up. The power of suggestion or the placebo effect or so many things that we understand can have real impact. Again, when you're trying to convince someone of a miracle or healing. And then, of course, all the social and psychological effects, the group psychology, the confirmation biases, witnesses reinforcing each other's beliefs. I'm sure this has even happened in her personal life or in the personal life of anyone that's watching, right? You're on a camping trip, you hear a weird noise. You probably know, and if you were alone, you might be scared, but you'd probably talk yourself into it's a squirrel and they sound bigger at night because anything moving sounds like a bear. But now you're on a camping trip with a few buddies and you say, did you hear that? And the other person goes, that sounded big. And all of a sudden, that little voice that normally would have told you it's a squirrel and you know better is like, oh yeah, it did sound big, bigger than a squirrel. And then your third buddy chimes in and he says, you know what, I heard there was higher bear activity in this area. And then you hear a scream from the next campsite down and someone screams, bear. But you don't know if they saw a bear or if they just heard something and assumed it was a bear. Maybe it was their dog named Bear. But this group effect is all coming together. And the next morning, everyone is going to get out of their tents and say, how crazy there was a bear here last night. What's even worse is that's when by happenstance, someone sees a bear track that was actually there yesterday that no one noticed, but now the confirmation bias of look, a track, and then they all go home with a camping story that a bear was in their camp and nothing happened. And that's just the quickest example of how this thing can develop and change. And yet everyone can go home with confidence, building off one another that this thing happened. And if you don't think that the same kind of thing happened in history to larger degrees with larger groups of people, then again, you'll need to explain the realities, I suppose, of every single miracle, healing, resurrection, and God appearance that has ever happened throughout time that would directly contradict God and Jesus being the only God. And what's funny, and I'll shut up in a minute, but I bet Melissa would be the kind of person to watch Mike Winger's thing on Benny Hinn and look at these faith healings that, by the way, require no technology whatsoever and say, yeah, look how obviously fake they are. And yet she would also say, Look at how Benny Hinn is fooling tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. How many people have believed what he was doing was real? Even Christians with the witness of the Holy Spirit inside them. I mean, she has proof in her own Christian community being called out by fellow internet apologists. And yet she's willing to say these kinds of things. It's baffling. So I'm done. I think I've beat a dead horse. Again, it's the kind of stuff you just want to talk about forever because there's example after example after example going off in my mind about just how wrong she is. But I digress. Thanks for being here. Wanted to keep it a little shorter, a little lighter after some of the heavier videos that we've had. I really appreciate everyone who's watched these last couple kind of more challenging to Christian videos. IP, by the way, is making a response to my response to him that comes out at 5 p.m. Thursday, we have Romans, and next Sunday, I have kind of a little art piece similar to the last beautiful thought I had about God. Until next time, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support, my Iconoclast, Ann, Boris, GVI, Jacob, Joe, Martin, Oliver, Perry, Rokkit, and Shawn, my Humanist heroes, Jarrod, James, and Kristi, my Atheist advocates, Caleb, Imposter, Jeff, Jeffrey, Karen, Paul, Sparky, and Todd, as well as all of my secular scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of this channel, or you just enjoy the content, please consider joining these fine people today.